The rattling of the stagecoach wheels filled the silence as Nora Blackett stared out at the vast Wyoming Territory landscape, her fingers nervously tracing the outline of the letter in her lap. It was 1878, and at 22 years old, she was heading to Cottonwood Springs to marry a man she'd never met. A fate that felt both terrifying and like her only chance at a future. The coach hit a particularly deep rut, causing the passengers to lurch forward. Nora caught herself with practiced movements, her right leg stiffening instinctively. The older woman across from her gave a sympathetic smile, but the well-dressed gentleman beside her didn't bother hiding his stare at Nora's rigid posture. "Mail order bride?" he asked, his eyebrows raised. Nora nodded, turning her gaze back to the window. The fewer words spoken, the less chance they'd hear the slight slur in her speech, another remnant of the childhood fever that had left her with a noticeable limp. "Bold choice for a woman with your condition," he continued, exchanging glances with his wife. "These frontier men expect sturdy women who can work the land." His wife patted his arm. "Gerald, please." But her eyes held the same doubt as she glanced at Nora's leg. Nora straightened her spine. "I can work as well as anyone," she said, the words coming out more confidently than she felt. 6 years of working in her father's general store after his stroke had proven that much. The man shrugged. "I'm sure your intended doesn't know about your impediment, or he'd have chosen differently." The words stung, though they weren't unfamiliar. Since the fever that had nearly killed her at 12, Nora had heard every variation of doubt and dismissal. After her father's death 3 months ago, with no family left and their modest home claimed by debt, the advertisement in the newspaper had seemed like providence. "Rancher seeks bride of good character. Age 1830, must be literate. Passage paid." She had written to Mr. Thomas Erickson, been honest about her limited prospects but not her physical condition, and received a swift reply with train fare enclosed. Now, as Cottonwood Springs appeared on the horizon, fear gnawed at her more fiercely than ever. The stagecoach pulled into the dusty Main Street just after 4 o'clock. Nora gathered her single carpetbag, heart pounding as she prepared to meet the man who would become her husband. She'd recognize him by the red kerchief he promised to wear. Stepping down from the coach was always the most difficult part. She grasped the handrail firmly, maneuvering her right leg carefully. Despite her concentration, her foot caught on the step, and she stumbled forward. Gasps and a few muffled laughs rose from the small crowd that had gathered to meet the stage. Nora's cheeks burned as she regained her balance. Through the blur of embarrassment, she scanned the onlookers for a red kerchief, but found none. "Miss Blackett." The station master approached with a folded note. "Message for you." Her fingers trembled as she opened it. "Regret to inform you Mr. Erickson took ill with typhoid 2 days past. Doc says he won't last the week. My condolences on your wasted journey." Sheriff Mills. The words swam before her eyes. She had no return fare, no prospects, nowhere to go. "Excuse me, madam." Nora turned to find a tall man in a worn leather vest standing a respectful distance away. His dark blonde hair curled slightly beneath a dust-covered hat, and his face was tanned from long days under the sun. He might have been 30, perhaps a few years older. "I couldn't help overhearing," he said, his voice low. "About Thomas. You know Mr. Erickson?" He nodded. "Roy Lowell, I ranch the adjoining property." His blue eyes were direct, but kind as they briefly flicked to her uneven stance before returning to her face. "Tom's a good man. This is a hard blow." Nora swallowed thickly. "It seems I've come a very long way for nothing." Roy shifted, appearing to consider something. "The boarding house is just up the street. Mrs. Patterson runs a decent place. Perhaps you could stay there while you figure things out. I'm afraid my funds are quite limited." The admission cost her pride, but honesty seemed the only practical approach. He studied her face. "I understand. Look, I need to check on Tom, but perhaps we could discuss options after. I'll come by the boarding house around supper time if that's acceptable," though caution told her to be wary of a strange man's kindness. Desperation won out. Nora nodded. True to his word, Roy appeared at the boarding house precisely at 6. Mrs. Patterson, a robust woman with sharp eyes but a surprisingly gentle manner, had already taken a liking to Nora and insisted on joining them in the parlor. "I've been thinking," Roy said after preliminary pleasantries. "Tom's sister Hannah has been looking for help with her millinery shop. She's getting on in years and struggles with the finer stitching." "I'm quite proficient with a needle," Nora offered, hope flickering. "Good. And there's a small cabin on the edge of town that's standing empty. Belongs to the Wilsons, but they moved to Colorado last spring. Needs some work, but it's sound. You could stay there while you earn your way." Mrs. Patterson nodded approvingly. "That old place by the creek, quaint little spot." "Why would you help me?" Nora asked, unable to mask her suspicion. Roy's expression softened. "Tom's my friend. He chose you for a reason, Miss Blackett. Seems wrong to let his good judgment go to waste just because fate dealt a cruel hand." The simplicity of his answer disarmed her. The next morning, Roy took Nora to meet Hannah Erickson, a sharp-witted woman in her 60s who took one look at Nora's neat appearance and asked to see her stitching. "Girl has talent," Hannah declared after examining Nora's handwork on her own collar. "I can use that. And I don't give two hoots about how you walk, long as your fingers work fine." For the first time since arriving, Nora felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Afterward, Roy showed her the cabin. It was humble but structurally sound, with 2 small rooms and a porch overlooking a shallow creek. "It needs a thorough cleaning and that back step is rotted through," Roy pointed out. "I can fix that for you." "You've already been too kind," Nora protested. He shrugged. "It's what neighbors do around here." Over the next week, Nora established herself in the cabin and began working with Hannah. News of Thomas Erickson's death came 3 days after her arrival. She attended the funeral, standing at the back of the gathering, feeling like an imposter mourning a man she'd never met. Roy found her afterward as the crowd dispersed. "You belonged here as much as anyone," he said quietly, seeming to read her thoughts. "I didn't know him," she replied, "but you were willing to bind your life to his, sight unseen. That counts for something." As spring blossomed into summer, Nora found herself settling into Cottonwood Springs. Hannah proved to be an excellent mentor, teaching her not just about millinery but about the townspeople and their histories. The work was steady, if not lucrative, and Nora began making small improvements to the cabin. Roy Lowell remained a constant presence, stopping by the shop to check on her, bringing occasional supplies to the cabin, or simply tipping his hat when their paths crossed in town. She learned he'd come west from Pennsylvania after the war, had built his ranch from nothing, and was respected throughout the territory for his fair dealings and steady character. What struck her most was that he never seemed to notice her limp. Or if he did, it didn't appear to matter to him. When they walked together, he naturally adjusted his stride to match hers without comment. On a warm July evening, Roy appeared at her cabin with a wagon full of lumber. "That porch railing won't last another season," he said by way of explanation. "Thought I'd fix it before the fall rains." Nora brought out coffee while he worked, and they fell into easy conversation. "I received a letter from my cousin in Boston today," she mentioned. "She's offered me a place in her home." Roy's hands stilled on the plank he was measuring. "Will you go? I've been considering it. Winter here will be harsh, and Hannah only needs help 3 days a week now." He nodded slowly. "Cottonwood Springs isn't Boston, that's certain, but there are things I appreciate here," she added hastily. "The openness of the sky, the way people look you in the eye when they speak." A small smile played at his lips. "And what does your heart tell you?" The question caught her off guard. No one had ever asked about her heart's desires before. "I'm not sure my heart gets much say in practical matters," she finally answered. Roy drove a nail with perhaps more force than necessary. Maybe it should. 2 days later, Nora was arranging hats in the shop window when she overheard a conversation outside between Roy and Clive Mercer, the banker's son. "You sure spend a lot of time helping that crippled milliner," Mercer's voice carried through the open window. Figured a man like you would set his sights higher. Nora froze, the hat in her hands suddenly weighing 100 pounds. Careful with your next words, Mercer. Roy's voice was dangerously quiet. Come now, Lowell, she's a nice enough girl, but she'd be a burden to any man. Can't work a ranch properly, can't dance at socials without making a spectacle. What kind of wife would that make? The kind with more strength and dignity than you'll ever comprehend, Roy replied evenly. There was a shuffling sound, then Mercer's voice again, higher pitched. No need to get riled up. I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. Then everyone's thinking wrong. That woman walked halfway across this country alone to make a new life when most would have given up. Every step she takes shows more courage than most men show in a lifetime. Suit yourself, Mercer scoffed, but don't say nobody warned you. Nora backed away from the window, her heart thundering. She hadn't realized Roy had developed such feelings for her or that others had noticed his attention. That evening, a knock at her door revealed Roy holding a small bouquet of wildflowers. These were growing by the creek, he said simply. She invited him in, acutely aware of his defense of her that afternoon but uncertain how to acknowledge it. They sat on the porch as twilight descended, speaking of inconsequential things until Roy finally broke the comfortable silence. I heard from the Wilsons today. They're selling this cabin. Nora's stomach dropped. Oh, I see. I bought it, he continued. Along with the acre surrounding it, you— What? Roy turned to face her directly. I want you to stay, Nora, not as a tenant, but because Cottonwood Springs has become brighter since you arrived. At least my corner of it has. Roy, you heard what Mercer said. People talk. Let them. His gaze was unwavering. Do you know what I see when I look at you? Not a woman with a limp. I see a woman who keeps going forward no matter how uneven the path. You walk straight into my soul, Nora Blackett. Tears pricked her eyes at the simple poetry of his words. I'm not whole, she whispered. None of us are. He reached slowly for her hand. I lost 2 fingers on my left hand at Antietam. He removed his glove to reveal a hand with a missing ring finger and pinky. Hit it pretty well, didn't I? Nora stared at his hand, then back at his face. You never said anything. Because it doesn't define me, just like your walk doesn't define you. For the first time, Nora allowed herself to fully acknowledge the feelings that had been growing for this quiet, steadfast man. What are you saying, Roy Lowell? I'm saying I'd be honored if you'd consider me as a suitor, properly with no rush. I know you came here to marry another man, and I respect that loss needs time. The gentleness of his proposal brought fresh tears. I'd like that very much. The courtship that followed became the talk of Cottonwood Springs, though not in the way either of them had feared. Roy took Nora on drives through the countryside, showing her his ranch with its modest herd and the apple orchard he'd planted 5 years earlier. They attended socials together, where Roy proudly led her in slower dances, his hand steady at her waist. Hannah watched their blooming relationship with approval. My brother would have been good to you, she told Nora one day as they worked. But Roy Lowell sees you in a way Tom never could have. When autumn painted the landscape in fiery hues, Roy invited Nora to a harvest festival in the neighboring town. The journey required an overnight stay, so Hannah accompanied them as a chaperone, her eyes twinkling with conspiratorial delight. It was during this trip that disaster struck. A sudden storm made the return journey treacherous. Their wagon wheel caught in a rain-swollen creek crossing, throwing all 3 passengers into the rushing water. Roy managed to pull Hannah to safety first, then fought his way back to Nora, who was struggling against the current, her right leg nearly useless in the churning water. I've got you, he shouted over the roar, wrapping his arm around her waist. Together they battled to shore, collapsing on the muddy bank. Roy immediately checked her for injuries, his face etched with concern. You came back for me, Nora gasped, coughing up creek water. I'll always come back for you, he replied, helping her to her feet. The accident left them stranded miles from town with night approaching. Roy spotted an abandoned line shack nearby, and they took shelter there, lighting a small fire to dry their soaked clothing. Hannah fell asleep quickly, exhausted by the ordeal, while Nora and Roy sat close to the fire. "You could have drowned trying to save me," Nora said softly. Roy looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "There was never a choice, Nora, because you're honorable. Because I love you." The simple declaration hung in the air between them. Nora reached for his hand, intertwining her fingers with his, damaged and whole alike. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I have since you offered to fix my porch step." His laugh was soft in the firelit darkness. "I was trying to find any excuse to see you." They were married the following month in a simple ceremony at the town's small church. Hannah gave the bride away, beaming with pride. Even Clive Mercer attended, offering a somewhat sheepish congratulation. Roy surprised Nora with his wedding gift. He had transformed the cabin by the creek into a proper home, adding a larger kitchen and a front porch swing wide enough for two. But the most touching addition was a series of shallow, regular steps leading up to the door, each one perfectly spaced for her uneven gait. "So you'll never stumble coming home," he explained. Life as a rancher's wife was not without challenges. The work was demanding, the weather unforgiving, and their first year together brought both a severe drought and the loss of several prized cattle to illness. Yet through it all, their partnership only strengthened. Nora continued working with Hannah 3 days a week, using her earnings to help improve the ranch. She started a vegetable garden that thrived under her care, and her practical mind often found solutions to problems that had stumped Roy for years. The following spring brought 2 significant changes to their lives. Hannah decided to retire, offering Nora full ownership of the millinery shop for a modest sum paid over 5 years. And more importantly, Nora discovered she was expecting their first child. The pregnancy was difficult. The town doctor expressed concern about the strain on her already compromised body. And for several terrifying weeks, Nora was confined to bed with the threat of losing the baby. Roy rarely left her side during this time, reading to her for hours, massaging her aching leg and speaking in soft, confident tones to the child growing within her. "This little one is strong, just like his mama," he would say, his hand resting gently on her belly. "Fighting to stay with us." When their son was born healthy and whole on a crisp October morning in 1880, they named him Thomas, in honor of the man whose passing had inadvertently brought them together. Little Thomas grew into a sturdy boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's determination. From his earliest steps, he instinctively matched his pace to his mother's when they walked together, a gesture that never failed to bring tears to Nora's eyes. By the time Thomas was 3, the ranch had expanded and prospered under Roy's careful management. They hired 2 hands to help with the cattle, allowing Roy more time with his family. Nora's millinery business thrived as well, gaining a reputation that brought customers from as far away as Cheyenne. On their 4th wedding anniversary, Roy took Nora on a picnic to the spot where he had first declared his love during that stormy night. "I have something to show you," he said, helping her down from the wagon. He led her to a clearing where a foundation had been laid and timber framed the beginnings of a structure. "What is this?" she asked, confused. "Our new home," he explained proudly. "Large enough for Thomas to have his own room and maybe a sister or brother someday." He paused, gauging her reaction. "And look," he pointed to the entrance where a gently sloping ramp replaced traditional steps. "So you'll never have to worry about stairs again," he explained. "I want every part of our home to welcome you exactly as you are." Nora wrapped her arms around him, overwhelmed by his thoughtfulness. "How did I ever get so fortunate?" "I ask myself the same question every morning when I wake up beside you," he replied, kissing her softly. Their new home was completed the following spring, just in time for the arrival of their daughter, Hannah Rose. Unlike her brother's birth, Hannah's came easily, as if the girl was eager to join the family that awaited her. As the children grew, so did the ranch and Nora's business. By 1885, They had one of the most respected cattle operations in the territory, and Nora had opened a second shop in the growing railroad town 20 miles east. Life wasn't without its hardships. Thomas contracted scarlet fever at age 7, sending a terrifying echo of Nora's childhood illness through the household. But unlike her parents, who had lacked access to proper medical care, Roy rode through a blizzard to bring the doctor from town, and their son recovered fully. One summer evening, as they sat on their porch watching their children chase fireflies in the gathering dusk, Roy took Nora's hand. "Do you ever think about that stagecoach ride?" he asked. "The one that brought you here?" Nora smiled. "Sometimes it feels like another lifetime." "Do you remember what you thought when you first arrived and learned Thomas had fallen ill? That I'd made a terrible mistake, that I'd come all this way for nothing." She squeezed his hand. "I had no idea I was exactly where I needed to be." Roy nodded toward their children. Thomas, now 9, was showing 5-year-old Hannah how to cup her hands gently around the glowing insects. "They're perfect," he said softly. "Yes, they are." Nora leaned her head against his shoulder. "And they don't see anything wrong with how their mother walks." "Because there isn't anything wrong with it," Roy replied simply. "It's just your way of moving through the world." In the spring of 1888, a decade after Nora's arrival in Cottonwood Springs, they received an unexpected visitor. Gerald Matthews, the well-dressed gentleman who had ridiculed Nora on the stagecoach, appeared at their door, his once proud bearing now hunched with age and hardship. "Mrs. Lowell," he said, removing his hat. "I doubt you remember me, but I remember," Nora interrupted, surprised at how little resentment she felt seeing him again. He nodded, shame evident in his expression. "My wife passed last winter. I've come west to live with my son, when I heard you had settled here successfully." "Well, I wanted to offer my apologies for my unkind words back then. I was wrong." Roy appeared beside Nora, his presence supportive but not protective. "Thank you for saying so, Mr. Matthews," Nora replied with genuine grace. "Would you care to stay for supper? Our children would enjoy hearing stories from back east." The evening that followed became a symbol of how completely Nora had transformed her life. Seated at the head of a table in a home filled with love, her limp was the least remarkable thing about her. Later that night, after their guest had gone and the children were asleep, Roy found Nora standing by their bedroom window, gazing at the stars. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, wrapping his arms around her waist. "I was thinking about journeys," she replied. "How the hardest ones often lead to the most beautiful destinations." Roy turned her gently in his arms. "You know, in all these years, I've never seen you walk straighter or taller than you did today, facing that man who once made you feel small." Nora reached up to touch his face, still handsome despite the lines that time had etched around his eyes. "That's because I've learned to see myself through your eyes, and in your eyes, I've never been anything but whole." "Because that's the truth," he said simply, before leaning down to kiss her with the same tenderness he'd shown from the beginning. Outside, the Wyoming night spread vast and star-studded above their home. Inside, a woman who had once been mocked for her imperfection rested in the arms of a man who had always seen her true strength, secure in the knowledge that some journeys, however difficult, lead exactly where we're meant to be.